I'm Damian, coming from Wrocław in Poland. You might now know me as the person that sends you the newsletter, weekly newsletter. If you are not subscribed, then this introduction might not really work for you, but I hope it's gonna work the next time we see each other, so please subscribe. It's pretty cool. I also did some open source work. Who of you is using Vue multi-select or is aware that it exists? Okay, not terrible. What about Viewlidate? Oh, yeah, more people to be afraid of. And then there's also Vue Global Events, which is the best library ever created because it doesn't require almost any maintenance, which is, yeah, the holy grail of open source developers. I also work at a company called CourseDog, and other than having a dog in its name and logo, it's also pretty cool because we are building a scheduling platform for US-based universities. And we are using Vue and Next.js. I would also like to thank all of my supporters on GitHub, which is VueConf, NativeScript, VueMastery, and VueJobs, and all the individuals that choose to help me fund my work on all the things Vue. So, Vue.js 3 for library authors. What's changing? First of all, those changes are more directed towards library authors because most app developers aren't using those, aren't building things that use those elements directly, like render functions. So for example, the H, which stands for hypertext, which is used to render the virtual DOM object, is becoming a global function that you have to import. Then there are some changes to the render function arguments. Those going to be unified between the functional components and regular components. And generally, this means quite a lot of migration if you have been using render functions. There are also some changes to the custom directives to fit into the new component lifecycle. And there are also some small changes to the attribute fall through, which means the class styles VON, which are the listeners, will all be moved to the $ads property, and $listeners will be removed. But those changes are kind of boring. I mean, you can read the RFCs and then later the release notes. And this doesn't really change the way we will be working with, building libraries. This is just part of the refactor, preparing for the new release, right? So what's really is exciting is the Composition API, and not just the Composition API as you might have already seen, but the things that make the Composition API possible, which is the Advanced Reactivity API and the Dynamic Lifecycle Hook injection. And I would like to focus on the Advanced Reactivity API because creating or setting up new lifecycle hooks, that was actually already possible if you knew the trick, but this is kind of new. I mean, new and not really new because we had libraries before Vue 3, so it's not exactly true. You were able to create reactive state and observe a state, react to those changes. So let's take a quick look on how this was done in Vue 2.0 and 2.x actually. So it was either done through a mixin. So the plugin was, when it was installed, it just extended all of the components or one component, and it created added let's say, a new computed property, which was kind of invisible for you, but when you were using the plugin, you had some additional properties on the component, right? So that's one strategy. The other was to create a new Vue instance in the plugin itself to manage, to create some computed properties, some reactive data, and maybe some watchers. And have you ever heard of this library? Yeah, it's like Vue with an X, yeah? So, and it has this interface. So you get the state, you got actions, mutations, and getters, right? So, but what it really is, it's just like a wrapper around a Vue instance. And you can see the state maps directly into data, and the getters map into computed properties. With actions and mutations, well, you don't have to map them to methods, so that's like unnecessary. This is just a small simplification, but generally speaking, Viewx is just like a Vue instance with some added convention on top of it. And if you were to look at the source code, you could see that this is exactly how it looks underneath Viewx. And this is how most library authors were building plugins that, if they are required to create some reactive state on the fly and connect it with your components. So sadly, this approach isn't very developer-friendly, and many of you might not have known about it, which makes sense because this is more like hacking your way through the Vue API to make something work, and it's not like something that we just get. It's not like a. The API is not obvious, and that's probably the biggest issue with it. And there are some issues, like problems that you can face when using this approach, like with the mixins. There is a risk that your plugin created properties might clash with other properties that some other plugin author has created, or maybe the application creator is adding those properties, and they might clash, right? Same goes for like extending the Vue prototype and so on. Same way, then we have the problem with spawning too many Vue instances. And when it comes to data, we could use vue.observable since 2.6. But I'm not really aware if there is a way to easily create computed properties other than spawning a new Vue instance just to create a computed property. So unless you're able to define all of the computed properties at once, so you can just create one Vue instance, you can't really add new computed properties like whenever you need those. So it's not very intuitive. You had to hack your way around Vue to add those functionalities. So what the Advanced Reactivity API really is a way to create standalone reactive state computed and watchers, which until now was something you required from you to have like a more in-depth knowledge of Vue internals. But right now, this is just like a given to you, and you can just use it without really thinking about it, like very easily. So there's a short example of a plugin, or in this case, a composition function coming from the Vue use web library. And this is a wrapper on the WebSocket API. And what it does is accepts, and let's try whether this works. Oh, it does. So it accepts an URL. Then we create two reactive properties, or variables, data and state, which is more like status. Then we have some functions that we will expose later to manage the WebSocket connection, whether to close it or whether to send a message. And then we have onMounted, which is the dynamic lifecycle hook that is being injected into the component that is using this composition function. And here we create a new WebSocket with the URL that we passed, and add some listeners that will be updating the reactive property. And when it's being unmounted, we just close the WebSocket, and the whole function just returns the data, the current state of the WebSocket, and the methods that we created before, which is close and send. So one to close the WebSocket and one to send messages. And this applies to creating like any kind of wrappers or new plugins. If you would like to create like an adapter for RxJS, like it would be almost as simple as this example, which is definitely a new thing, and like I'm very much looking forward to seeing the new libraries for Vue 3, which will utilize this and probably make everything much, much simpler. So what existing library could make use of all of this? And since some of you already are using it, and you might not be happy with it, I'm not happy with it, my guess would be Viewlidate. Because this is exactly what Viewlidate is doing. When it traverses, and I think there was a talk about Viewlidate yesterday, so when it traverses the state tree and sets up validations, it has to create some validators on the fly, which sometimes might require some internal state, like for async validators. And it required to it had to create multiple Vue instances for basically for every level of the tree, which isn't very good. So when it started in 2016, so yeah, it can be considered legacy code at this point, I guess. Like a year later, it's already legacy in JavaScript, I guess. So it just started as a very simple computed property, which is the strategy by extending an existing component with a computed property. So we are adding to the options $V computed property, which is like going through all the key validations, which is using the validations property from the component object, and then sets up some rules and returns the results. That's I'm not going into depth here because that's not the important part. And then a month later, we added asynchronous validators. And this required actually, because you can do asynchronous code inside a computer property, right? Have you tried it? Yeah, it doesn't work. It's very interesting why. So that's a nice thing to investigate. So we had to create a new Vue instance just to create some local state for this validator for creating asynchronous validators. And then, almost 2 years later, we ended up with this. Do you know what this is? Does it look familiar? Okay. Well, this is, I already mentioned H. Like, it stands for almost the same. Like, this creates a virtual DOM-like object which contains the results of validations, just so we could div those within list validations with the $each helper. And it was just a mess, like a complete, I just hate it. Like, I personally hate it. But it fixed some issues with being able to track how, like when you remove some elements, and then there were some issues with the validations, like showing results for a different result in the list instead of the correct one, and then like keeping the local state of the validator so it doesn't have to rerun every time you make a change in the list. So this fixed it, but also introduced the whole virtual DOM diffing algorithm into the library, which is, I mean, kind of an overkill. Won't you agree? I do agree with myself on this. So the code got very hard, very complicated, hard to maintain, and probably that's why it's on a very slow release schedule, I guess. But let's see whether we can change that. So I added the Vue Composition API library, which kind of gives us the way to, or enables us to use Vue Composition API inside the current version of Vue. So it's pretty good to play with it, experiment, try to maybe rewrite or like write or make some changes to the library, and that's what I did. So at first I was kind of confused, but then I read the documentation for the Composition API, and I was like, oh, I totally get it. Like that's easy, right? Except I was like still getting like tons of errors with the reference, where like when you build your library, sorry, your application, you know whether this is a reference or this is a reactive property. And with reference, you have to access the dot value, right? And when you are building a library, you can't really know what the user will pass to you. So you have to always check whether this is a reference, so a computed property, or a ref, which contains the dot value, or whether there's just a plain variable, right? So there is one function, utils function, that you will ever need, and I think this should be included in Vue 3. And it just unwraps the value. Like, it checks whether the variable is a reference, and if it is, just return value, and if not, just return the variable. Like, once I did this, it was like, ooh, now everything works perfectly. Like, I wouldn't recommend that, but the dog is really awesome. So, yeah, I very much like dogs, as you might have noticed. So, some improvements to the VueLidate library. To create just a result, validation result, which is synchronous, we can just create a new computed property. Inside, we just take the rule, take the validator, run it against the model, so the state that we want to validate, and depending on what it returns, we just return the value. That's a computed property. It's going to be lazy. Perfect. When it comes to asynchronous validators, what we can do is we can create a reference here. We can create a new watcher, which is watching on the model. And then in the callback, we get the new model value, where we can call the validator, which returns a promise. And then we can wait for the promise to resolve, update the pending state, update the invalid state. And if there is an error, we can do the same, right? And we can set it up to lazy, so it doesn't run the asynchronous validation once we create it, right? And then we just return the invalid state, which is pretty cool because we managed to unify the interface. So no matter whether it's an asynchronous validator or whether it's just a synchronous validator or maybe other types of validators in the future, it just returns the invalid property, and that's it. So that's pretty cool. And I was like, okay, when preparing the talk, I was like, what tips, what tricks, what unobvious ways to use the composition API could I show? And I did some research, playing with, I tried to work with VueLidate to figure out what edge cases could I find, but I really haven't found any. And that's the most disappointing part, probably for you, because you came here to see the hear about how you can use the Vue 3 for your libraries, and there is just nothing much to it. It just gets out of the way, and instead of, but I think that's a good thing in general, because you don't have to focus on how to do things. You can just focus on what you want to create, and it just works. It takes out the complexity that you might have right now within your libraries, within your plugins, and it just allows you to write exactly what you need without thinking on any hacks, any tricks, how to do it in Vue. You don't have to think about it at all. It just gets out of the way, which is pretty cool. And yeah, that would be it, except I ended up playing a bit more and rewrote the whole library. So there it is, VueLidate 2.0, because it was so pleasant. So I was like, why not? Oh. And you can check out the source code. It's half the code and quarter the complexity. I mean, it's really simple, which is a surprise because I was thinking VueLidate is very complicated library. It's not. The previous code was because of all the hacks, and right now those are not needed. And you can even install it, but you will need the Vue /Composition API plugin installed to play with it. We also split the library into VueLidate core and validators. So all the validators live as a separate package, so we can release those separately, which is good because we should be more open to adding new validators that you can submit, because those won't affect the library itself, the core. So, and it's an alpha release right now, for obvious reason, because, well, Vue 3 isn't here, but it should be there, as in like the final release once Vue 3 is released, so probably early next year, I think so. Some quick facts. It's written from scratch, built for Vue 3. You can try it out with Vue 2.x, with the plugin mentioned. And it's also mostly backwards compatible. So let's just take a peek at the new API. So we have the setup method, and I guess you should be already familiar how it works. So we create like two variables, password and repeat password, which start as empty strings, and we just return those. And then we import the use validate from this fancy colored library. That's Keynote. I don't know why it happens. And then we need to pass first the rules, which is the same object that you will pass inside validations property in validate, and then the state. So in this case, it will look like this. So we pass the, so this is our rules. So for the password, we want to have the required validator and a min-length validator, which accepts a variable, for example, like, well, how long should the password be? In this case, 7. And then we have a repeat password, which we want to validate with same as validator. And then we just pass the variable that we want to compare to. And this returns the $V or whatever you name it. And we can just return it, and it should work. Yeah, that's what I meant by it should map. Like those objects should be mapped to each other, the properties. Okay, what about backwards compatibility? Turns out the only thing that was required to enable backwards compatibility, so with the old or the current options or object-based syntax, is this part. I think there's, which is just create, like up until now, just create a new computer property and call the setValidations method, which is kind of the same as use validate, and it just returns the current validations. And for the state, we just pass this, which is equals the whole component. So we have access to computer properties, data, Vuex getters, and state, and all of those things. Okay, and yeah, this is how this is how you use it right now. This is how you will be able to use it once the new version ships. No changes, except maybe you've noticed this with message helper. And this allows us to add a message to our validator, which is one of the things that wasn't present in the current version. So finally, we are adding support for error messages, which I think is pretty late. It's probably pretty late. But it's pretty cool, and it should work with translations, because you can pass either a string or a function. But it might seem like a lot of work, like to always add use the with message helper. That's why we made it so that all the 21 built-in validators that we have, they all come with default messages and params already. And they are all fully tree-shakeable, so you can like pick which ones do you want to import. And we also allow you to use the raw versions, which are still just functions. So you can if you want to add your own messages, you can just use the raw version and wrap it inside your message. You can even like pre-configure and re-export some validators for like commonly used properties, if you like. And this is how a validator can look like, as in the validator object or function, if it's if it requires some arguments to set up. So we have the, I can just watch here. We have the validator, which accepts the function that will be used as the rule, the validator itself. Then we have a message that could be a function or a string, and params, which is just used to identify like what arguments have been passed to the validator, like when we were setting it up. Okay, short demo time. Okay, is it visible? I think so. So we got an email address, and let's just like type something. And we are like verifying whether there is an async validator, whether this email is already taken. And as you can see, we have, oh yeah, I haven't mentioned this yet, but we have this meta field, which is errors. Because right now, every validator has an errors array, which returns all the errors found for this validator, for this property. And then once we go up to in the tree, like back to the root, we are collecting all of those errors and merging them into one errors, and then the same like recursively up to the very top. So as you can see, you get access to errors meta property, which collects all the errors within the form. So if I just say like this, okay, everything is all right except for the password, so it has to be required. So I just do ABC, and it's now it's not long enough, so just add one, and then we have the repeat password, which is doesn't match, so we just do ABC1, and now it works. Okay, that's pretty cool. And yeah, we could say goodbye to the validate error extractor. So sorry, Dobromir, if you're watching this. Although from what he told me, it could become like an UI helper to just like make it even easier to display errors, and probably help with like doing some adapters for other UI libraries. So there are some breaking changes. We are removing each. Oh, I'm almost out of time. So there will be an every and some helpers that you can use instead of that. It's pretty simple. And it should give you the information which property in the which index is failing. Or you can move the validators to a child component, which is something completely new. Like right now, you had to put all of your validations in one component. And what we want to do, and yeah, that's the roadmap. Memorize it. I won't spend time on it because I just got like 3 minutes. Context-aware validations. So what we want to introduce, and it is not yet done, but I have a prototype which was like almost working, which means it didn't work, but it should be working soon. And whenever we have a child component which has its own validation rules, the results will be pushed to the any ancestor, like direct ancestor, or like indirect ancestor, which also contains validate, and registered there. So your root form will always know whether any child components have their own validation rules and whether they are passing or not. So you won't have to keep your schema in just one component. You can just use multiple components with their own validations, and they will just automatically report back to the root form without any of your work. And that's the team. Marina Mosti, who's there, Natalia, who's also there, Dobromir, who's in Bulgaria, so hey, and Ben Hong, who is somewhere there, and yeah, the guy on the stage, that is me. And I would say like that's it, but there is one more thing, which is formulate, which is a pun of the word formulate, yeah. And it's a schema-based form generator with the idea where you have to bring your own components. We don't provide any UI components because those are hard to maintain and so on. It's like super small. But what we want to do is make it possible to integrate with validate easily, so that you could include your validation rules inside the schema. which with the context-aware validations should make it like very easy to work with. And then also build some adapters for UI libraries like Vuetify, so you could generate the Vuetify forms with this with Formulate, which would also contain validators. And I do have a demo, short demo. I have like 22 seconds, which is more than enough, right? So, and this is how it looks like. This is the schema. Oh no, I can't. So this is the schema. We pass in directly the components that we want to use, some config. We can just like pass a component which will manage its own like properties if you want. And once we start typing, it just shows up here. And it doesn't have to be a simple form. Like you could just have a model which opens any component you want. And as long as it accepts a value and emits an input event, so basically a V model, it can work with, and the schema can also be dynamic. Bam. Okay, that's me. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it.